The real pain is the one you can see. This is one example of the many ways religion and culture have gotten in the way of mental health throughout the years. At least in my culture, seeking help or even admitting you need it, it's completely unacceptable. And I know this does not only happen in the Latin American culture. This should not happen, but it is hard enough to seek help as it is. It is even harder to ask someone to turn their back on their religion or on their culture to do so. That's why our next panel will discuss the need to rethink the dominance of the biomedical model of mental health care and the role of religious and indigenous practices. So please join me on welcoming our guests. Mike Niconchuk, Program Lead at the Wend Collective. Rana Dajani, Professor of Molecular Biology at the Hashemite University in Jordan, Visiting Professor for MIT Systems Awareness Lab, as well as founder and director of We Love Reading, Sunitha Krishnan, co-founder of Prajwala, and Sangeetha Thomas, Director of Mental Health Ministries and the Assembly of Canonical Orthodox Bishops of the United States of America. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Friday afternoon and evening, and this is one of the last panels. I personally appreciate all of your effort and attention being here. This is a really distinguished group of folks that are on this stage with me. I feel very honored. By way of brief introduction, as they mentioned, my name is Mike Niconchuk, and I have the honor of having these three folks here to talk about an incredibly complex topic. We have Dr. Rana Dajani, who's a molecular biologist, social entrepreneur, and global thought leader from Palestine. As mentioned, she's a visiting professor at MIT and a Morciel Fellow. She's been recognized as a Fulbright Fellow, Eisenhower Fellow, Ashoka Fellow, and named one of the most 100 influential Arab women by Arabian Business. She's also a tireless supporter of building indigenous research capabilities in the developing world and mentoring younger folks, particularly women scholars in the STEM fields. We also have Sangeetha Thomas, Director of Mental Health Ministries at the American Assembly of Canonical Orthodox Bishops of the United States. That's a mouthful. Sangeetha is also a licensed counselor and sits at an interesting intersection of working directly with faith leadership and also maintaining clinical practice. In addition to managing the National Needs Assessment and Directory of Mental Health Professionals, she's coordinated the development and launch of a crisis response training program called Peace of Mind, which equips clergy and lay ministry leaders in mental health first aid and in Orthodox bridging, which she'll talk a bit about, I'm sure. As a psychotherapist, Sangeetha works with adults of diverse backgrounds who are healing from trauma, exploring multiracial identity and intergenerational trauma as children of immigrants, or learning how to integrate their faith more broadly in their identity. And of course, we have Sunitha Krishnan, who, what do we say about you, Sunitha, after that fantastic and incredibly beautiful but dark and complex presentation that raises many important questions and should have convicted everyone in earshot and in the entire city. Sunitha is a force to be reckoned with and is the founder of Prajwala, which is Asia's largest institution combating commercial sexual exploitation. Since 1996, she's rescued more than 26,000 young girls and women who have been victims of sex trafficking across 12 countries, and has provided all sorts of rehabilitation services for them. She received India's 4th highest civilian honor and is recognized as among the 150 fearless women in the world by Newsweek, as you deserve. Sunitha is also the recipient of the Talberg Eliasson and SNF Stavros Niarchos Foundation Global Leadership Prize, the Franco-German Prize for Human Rights, Vital Voices Leadership Prize, Living Legends Award, and Aurora Peace Prize, and the CNN Real Hero Award, among several others. So, yes. I remember reading as a child the words of someone who I think everyone in this room has heard of, Jesus. At least the Greeks, I'm sure, have heard of him. He says, my God, why have you forsaken me?" We have one of the world's foremost figures, recognized figures, the epicenter of the Christian faith, a major prophet in Islam, a global recognized prophet in many other religious frameworks as well, asking why God had forsaken him. Find me a prophet that didn't have a mental health journey, that didn't have a mental health struggle, and I bet you couldn't. Religion has been around much longer than psychiatry. I don't think that my great-grandfather, as Theo talked on this stage yesterday about shirts that can be infused with a silk substance that can detect hormone changes of mental health challenges, I don't think my great-grandfather needed a shirt that changes colors to tell him that he was depressed. Priests have held the trauma of people in their hands a lot longer than psychiatrists and psychologists' couches have. So as we've heard so much about these biomedical explanations and explorations of the human condition and the various pathologies and illnesses that we have come to create names for around the world, these explanations have flourished as religion and religiosity and religious practice has declined in many societies. But now we're seeing that biomedical model come into question, and increasing investments in things like plant-based medicine and psychedelics, in indigenous practices, and potentially and hopefully in the role of faith traditions in how we deal with mental health. So with that, we need to ask, what is the role of faith in all of this, and why haven't we talked about it so far? I'll start with Sangeetha. You're a clinician, and you work very closely with the Orthodox Church. Psychologists and psychiatrists are statistically among the least religious professionals in the United States. And the clergy is not well trained in psychology, and many, not just in Christianity, but across faith traditions, are openly hostile to secular mental health practice. What frustrates you about being in that bridge role that you have?
Yeah, that's a great question. So starting this conversation about religion, culture, and mental health with the idea of tension is the perfect place to start. And tension is not something that is necessarily good or bad or black and white. As a therapist, I come across that very often with my clients, and I encourage them to consider that in some circumstances in life, tension is not something that we need to try to release by choosing one side or the other. There are a lot of situations that we may encounter emotionally, spiritually, or otherwise that challenge us to learn how to grow by holding that tension and holding it well, rather than seeking to release it. And that's what I want to challenge all of you as you sit here and you consider your own religion, your own culture, your own mental health, and seek to find how we can have a dialogue about this. And what we have done in the Assembly of Bishops Mental Health Ministries is we've created a ministry that's built on the radical idea that faith and mental health are not mutually exclusive, that they're not in competition with one another, that we do still recognize that there is a tension. Yes, historically there is absolutely a tension between psychiatry or psychology and theology, where there's debates about, are we making people too dependent? Are we making them too independent? Are we guilting them and shaming them? Or are we challenging them to a higher moral standard? And those debates can go on, and I won't get into all of that, but generally speaking, what we will say, what we would say in our ministry is that rather than polarizing, that we can learn from one another, that we can take a collaborative approach. And when we do collaborate between these different disciplines, we actually end up enhancing the competency within each one. So a clinician who is able to recognize the value of religion is more culturally competent. And a member of the clergy, a priest, a faith leader, who is able to recognize the value of medical care or therapeutic care is more competent in being a spiritual care provider. And we do this in our ministry by building an entire ministry that's built on the core theology of the Orthodox Church, that every human being is essentially body and soul, physical and spiritual. And so when we talk about health, when we talk about wellness, when we talk about illness, when we talk about treatment and care, that we have to address the whole person, every part of them. And so a clinician should absolutely respect faith identity. A priest should absolutely respect medical and mental health. And that's why we created this program, Peace of Mind, which Mike had mentioned earlier. This program starts with the theology. We start where our people are, where their comfort is, where their trust is, and we introduce them to the context of the Orthodox Church. How do we understand health and wellness and holistic care? And then we lead our clergy and our ministry leaders into a program called Mental Health First Aid. And it teaches them how to identify the signs, the symptoms at a very, very basic level of mental health crises, substance use crises, just how to identify it and how to recognize it so that a clergy member or a priest or any faith leader for that matter, when they are providing pastoral care or they're providing confession or they're even going to a house, which is very common in the Orthodox Church, to go and care for the people in their own homes, that they would be able to recognize, oh, this is a mental health concern. And then to refer responsibly and encourage them to seek higher level care through medical professionals. And this is actually quite related to last night. Former President Barack Obama had spoken about the road to democracy being very slow, and that it takes a lot of time and a lot of effort to sit down with someone who believes something different and try to find a common ground. So yes, is it frustrating? Absolutely, and because it's slow, but it's so worth it, and it's much better to go about it this way than to polarize and get caught up in that tension.
And I love the optimism, but I'm going to push you a little bit on that.
Sure.
So religious groups, and especially religious leadership, have also perpetrated and caused the trauma of thousands of people around the world, including various leaders of various churches. I'm not saying Orthodox, Catholic, Evangelical. I'm sure offenders abound, including church leadership who has perpetrated and covered up the rape of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of boys and children of, it's an agendered phenomenon here. So at the same time, why should anyone take the churches and church leadership's stance on mental health or even role in mental health care with any grain of seriousness?
Absolutely. Great question. And I appreciate the boldness of the question. And I know for some sitting in the audience, you might be kind of sitting up straight now because of what Mike has mentioned. But these are the things that we should be talking about. If we shy away from them and we pretend like they didn't happen, it actually makes the situation far worse. To complicitly say that you're ignoring a person who has gone through something that we just can't deny. These are historical facts. Whether they're contemporary or anybody who's gone through any kind of world history class knows that there is a long history of religion being weaponized and wars being started in the name of God. And so that is something we have to acknowledge and be aware of. So I would actually challenge religious communities, religious institutions to start with being honest. Face that problem head on. We have that is a responsibility. We have to take responsibility for our part. We have to recognize when there were direct actions, like Mike had mentioned, abuse. And then we also have to recognize the other side of it, which is inaction, negligence. When we fail to act when we should have, that is also something we need to take responsibility for. And we also, second to that, we need to care for the people who have been hurt. We need to look at this not just as a problem to be fixed, but people to be cared for. And we have to have a commitment to change, too. We have to have a commitment to going back and looking at what systems were in place that allowed this, enabled this to happen, and what are we going to do tangibly, measurably, over time, with dedication to move through that, to be better than that, and to say that what happened was unacceptable. And we have to have the humility, the self-awareness, the maturity to be able to do that and not just become scandalized by these conversations. And in psychotherapy, this is, and you're aware, Mike, as a clinician as well, that we call this rupture and repair. So this is what I mean by collaborating between disciplines, that we can learn methods of repairing relationships through the clinical world and even apply them to the pastoral care world. So in every healthy relationship, there are ruptures. There are things where you have arguments between parents and children, husband and wife, friends, siblings, whatever. And it's not about avoiding the rupture. It's not about avoiding the argument. Obviously, in cases of abuse, there's going to be a clear sense of avoiding that and preventing that. But there are also going to be things like stigmatizing language, right? That reflects that there is maybe a personal bias. Maybe there is shame in the culture. We have to take responsibility for the rupture. We have to look at it straight on and then make our amends for it, work towards change, and say we need to do something different. And we work towards repair in that type of a way. And if we can do that, if we can commit ourselves to taking responsibility and working towards repair, we can rebuild trust. Now, I will say, you pushed me, so I'm going to push you back a little bit. For non-religious groups, this question also challenges you to realize that religious individuals are statistically more likely to go to a religious leader or faith leader or someone in their own community because of the trust that is there. So for them, we are the first responders. And so for non-religious people who are looking from the outside in and seeing the scandals, I feel your anger. And also, if you were to discredit our voice altogether, you would be doing a disservice to those individuals who come to us first, who come to the religious leaders first. So does our voice belong at the table? Yes, absolutely. We also have a very strong responsibility to put on our big boy pants and our big girl pants and take responsibility for what has been done and make sure that the voice that we bring to the table is one of humility and not of ignorance.
Well, I think that's very much in line with what was mentioned in the panel earlier that was talking about it's not there's an incredible amount of victimization that has occurred at the hands of the secular therapy industry, at the hands of psychiatry as well, where basically rebellious black folk were labeled with all sorts of disorders posthumously to make an excuse for why they were so rebellious and causing so many civil rights problems. Homosexuality was a mental disorder until only a couple of decades ago. So it's not, we can share that love of victimization all around the industries. But I want to take a slightly different turn here. When we think about, even in the introduction of this panel, there was already a bias talking about is religion a barrier to mental health? Okay, let's flip it around. For the millions of people for whom their religious practice is the primary source of meaning and resilience in their lives. Sunitha, let's talk about your homeland for a little bit here. One of the earliest descriptions that historians have found of descriptions of trauma-related flashbacks, which is a core symptom of post-traumatic stress disorder, actually comes from around 3000 BC from the Ramayana, so from sacred texts of the Indian subcontinent. Now, thousands of years later, very well-meaning white folk are selling their trauma-informed yoga practices, which come from Ayurvedic traditions, back to poor folks. If Eastern philosophies have a rich tradition of effective mental health care, why isn't India leading the world in terms of trauma recovery? Is it just colonialism?
Mike, let me just find my leg. I'm hanging in the air. So let me just put myself a little more firmly on the ground. I would go even further than Ramayana. In the Vedas, which is the Hinduism, by the way, is not a religion, it's a way of life of millions of people, over 100 billion population is what we are talking about. Way back in 2 BCE millennium, we're talking about the Vedas, and Atharva Veda has a chapter called as Manovikara, which is mental disorders. Ayurveda, which comes from the Charaka Sangeetha and the Sushruta Sangeetha. These are the first original texts. The first surgeon, first physician were born in India more than 4,000 years back. And the texts are so clear about what is mental disorders, what is the various kinds of symptoms and symptomologies. So much so that the 1967 definition of psychotherapy, verbatim, is the definition that you see in Atharvaveda and maybe in a different language. The Wahlberg's definition of psychotherapy. So somewhere down the line, East and India has been the custodians of not just mental health understanding, but also scientific way. Because if you look at Ayurveda, it's a science of life, and the WHO definition of health and well-being is what Ayurveda is talking about, the balance between body, mind, and soul. But where did we go wrong? We went wrong with invaders coming into our country. We went wrong with colonial powers coming into our country. And anywhere where there's colonialism, the attitude is what we don't understand either is a superstition or it is uncivilized. And slowly, Ayurveda, everything else became either superstition, cultural practices which are regressive, till some white Westerner sold it in the West and say, oh yoga, oh Osho, oh spiritual, oh meditation, oh pranayama. Today now everybody is talking about yoga in the West. So my question counter to you, Mike, I am not going to answer your question, but I'm going to ask you a question. Who is the validating authority for evidence-based understanding? Who is it? Is it the Yale University? Is it the Harvard? Is it the Oxford? So if they don't see the Ayurvedic science, which is a proper science, in India, you have a medical course for Ayurveda, then if it is not validated by the Oxfords and Harvards, it has no validation. So there is a racial element in it. There is a colonial element in it where you don't respectfully recognize the ancient wisdom coming from different countries. And India is the custodian of one of the most ancient wisdoms in mental health practices.
And Rana, you've been in the business of taking hair samples from traumatized Muslim folks and then publishing your findings for consumption by white rich folks in English. So let's talk about data for a second, based on Sunitha's point. The arbiters of data, the generation, the West finds so much data and evidence for the things that they're looking for. Like if I'm looking for my keys where the spotlight is shining, I'm not looking in the dark, am I? I'm just looking in the place where I'm shining the light. So the generation and acceptance of evidence is largely controlled by the West, and it's in English, and it's for pay. And it focuses on secular practice or kind of sexy plants that we find in the Amazon that aren't quite religious, so they're fundable by federal funds to research them. So help me understand, what's the hesitance of evaluating the way that you pray when you're doing most of the same postures that Sunitha's talking about with her yoga?
That's a very important question. And actually, as a scientist, the hallmark of a scientist is that you make observations and then you try to understand the observations. Unfortunately, science, which should be neutral and should be objective, when anything related to religion is an observation, suddenly it's neglected, it's swept under the carpet, and it doesn't exist, which to me is mind-blowing, because it's so hypocritical that you want to be a scientist, but there are certain things you stop being a scientist. And I remember I engaged with a number of scientists when I'm a molecular biologist, so I work in proteins and genes, which have nothing to do with religion. They're just, you measure a concentration of a chemical. So when I was invited, where I work on biomarkers, as you mentioned, trying to understand how impacts of trauma impact not just our behavior, but also our physiology, and then our DNA. And so I got thrown into the whole mental health field, and I started questioning why, when we start measuring these things, how do we claim that how we behave is just, through a self-report is enough to explain what's happening in our bodies, because our behavior is so complex. And when we start asking those questions in interviews, faith immediately is brought up. That's how I cope. If I'm upset, I wake up in the morning before dawn and I pray. When I go to the mosque on Friday, we're a whole group of people, we pray together. When we fast together, and these are methods of coping with everyday things, in addition to extreme trauma that a refugee will go through, or a multiple displacement or immigration will go through. But those are denied because they don't hold legitimacy. And so how do we, and not just denied by the scientists, but even if they come up in the surveys or in the interviews, they're brushed away. You don't find a paper talking about how faith boosted somebody's mental health. We recently published a paper talking about COVID, religion, and Islam. Why don't we invoke religion to help us spread good practices for COVID? Drawing upon our history, similar to what you said, that in the Muslim civilization, which was not about just being Muslim, you had Jews, you had Christians, you had Hindu, you had multiple religions living under this civilization, and the prime example is Spain. And people, there was mental health hospitals, as Sunitha explained, this is something that is dealt with, it has a physiological reason, it's respected. The concept of quarantine came from there. So why don't I use that same premise and history to help people have identity and agency, as well as to pick up these good practices and start doing them instead of complaining that why don't people pick up good practices. But in addition to that, people themselves, because today, people are going to say, but today is different, right? We're living modern day today. The challenges we face are different. Yes, but the way we tackle our challenges is by co-creating within a community solutions to deal with the problems we face. But unfortunately, many of these solutions come from the West, global North to global South if you want, although I hate these terms, and probably one call is to change all this terminology, because what you say reflects how you think. So if we're using those words, we're propagating that feeling among people of the global South of victimization, that you are ignorant, you don't know. And so people stop trusting themselves, trusting their religion, and then they're lost. They don't have anything else to go to. And so why can't we reclaim that and think up of new ways of dealing with trauma that we draw from our religion, our basic faith? And by the way, religion is based on shared universal values of doing good, of taking care of your neighbor, of not lying, of being empathetic and altruistic. This is shared. We find it in different ways, but ultimately these are shared. So why don't we draw upon hundreds of thousands years of evolution that made us social creatures? Right? We're social. And unfortunately, one of the challenges of modernity is that the West is becoming more individual and less community, and that causes a lot of mental health problems. While in our communities, we have a lot of social, and yet we are not allowed to practice it because then we would appear as if we're not civilized enough. Or in severe cases, when we work with Syrian refugees, if you ask them, how do you deal with your mental health? They're not going to tell you, I pray every morning, because they're scared you're going to tell them they're a terrorist. And also all these misconceptions about religion, when you have like Islam, 1.7 billion Muslims in the world, how many of them do something wrong? And this is in every religion, even secularism, which is a religion on its own. So we need to trust each other. And I think there's a problem of lack of trust in people to save themselves and come up with solutions.
The blaming is easy, Rana, and I think that one of the ways that if you ask Syrian refugees how they cope with their mental health is by getting on a boat to Greece and then sinking. That's how some folks are trying to cope with what they're dealing with day in and day out with the excessive trauma that they've lived through for generations. But at the same time, if there's such a rich historical legacy of effective mental health care at the Diyar al-Shifa. So Dar al-Shifa is the Arabic word for what was in Andalusia in Spain, these houses of healing, Dar al-Shifa, house of healing. And they had this concept. So there's these rich traditions, but at the same time, we have a situation now where countries like Jordan, Palestine, Lebanon have some of the most atrocious mental health statistics. I work day in and day out in these countries. 40% anxiety and depression rates in some communities, and that's Jordanians, Palestinians, Lebanese, not refugees. And these are very practicing devout religious countries. And Jordan was recently in the news because they have now criminalized attempting suicide in public places. Go do it at home. So square that circle for me. If we're talking about a rich history of effective practices, indigenous faith practices, yet abysmal statistics in terms of symptoms now.
Well, first of all, the media loves to stereotype. They only tell the negative stories. There are a lot of positive stories as well. And I'm sure each one of you suffers from the same thing. Well, somebody will tell a story about your country, your culture, your religion that you know is not true. And that's why these meetings are very important. So we meet the real person and we hear the real story behind the media. So that's number one. Number two, if you're speaking about our part of the world, which is the Levant, right? It's Lebanon, Syria, Palestine, Jordan, Iraq. Unfortunately, in the last 100 years, it's been a playground for politics, economics of the superpowers. We speak of British occupation, French occupation in the late 19th century. Fast forward, British handing over Palestine to Zionism and the creation of the State of Israel, which is, I'm a daughter of a refugee who left in 1948. And we still have the key to our homes in West Jerusalem. We have not been able to go back. So a trauma that is not one event, but a continuous experience that never stops. People want to go home, that they can't. The US invasion of Iraq and the millions of people who were displaced, the sanctions, the hunger, the children dying, still going on now. And now Syria. So this exodus of war and trauma and displacement for other people's agenda is a reason why trauma has increased. So that's number two. Number three, as we talk about trauma, and I mentioned how people define it as one event when it's actually a continuum in this context, and it's complex. It's not one thing that you can measure with a survey or put a number on. Which leads me, the way we measure trauma is wrong. Because if we focus on, like I said, trying to put in a number when it's complex, and we focus on an event when it should be continuum. So we need to interrogate, change how we measure trauma. And the only way to do that is to involve the local people as scientists from the culture, from the context, to help design new tools to measure correctly and understand correctly what's going on in that body. Hence the biomarkers, the surveys. But not just that. We also need to keep in mind about stopping the source of all the trauma. We can't just also talk about how we're going to deal with the trauma without mentioning the money and who's gaining from all of this. And then lastly, when we also talk about trauma, we always talk about it in very negative connotations. And yet people have been involved in this trauma for not decades, hundreds of years in different contexts. It has its negative, but people have flourished. People have survived. We're a species. Why don't we understand the human as a whole, the negative and the positive? How we develop resilience. How we do not want, because if we only focus on the negative, we are victimizing the people. We're saying, oh, I need to take care of you. You're traumatized. And you're taking away their agency, which even makes them even worse. So how can we flip it and look at it as a whole human being, acknowledging the trauma, the negative, but celebrating the positive, but not to celebrate the trauma itself, but to maintain dignity, to give dignity back to the people, and to trust them. Because then they can come up with solutions, and then you can reverse the tide, or at least handle the trauma and what's happening in a much more positive way. And it's about designing a whole new framework of how you look at the world.
Okay, designing a whole new framework. Sangeetha, Sunitha, Sangeetha, to you first. You're a clinician. Do we need your kind? Should we just do away with all psychiatrists and mental health clinicians?
I hope not, and so otherwise I'm out of a job as soon as I get back from Greece. No, I wouldn't say we get rid of. I think it's a matter of we need to understand how we can bring the best of both worlds. And as a therapist, like I work with clients who are coming to me from a faith background, and sometimes they come to me out of trauma, or sometimes they come to me because I have the same cultural background as them. Why would we get rid of that?
I'll let you answer that, Sunitha.
What was the question?
Should we get rid of the psychiatrists who have taken and bastardized what your culture has produced for millennia?
I think, Mike, this divisive attitude is our problem. It is not about this or that. Each has its own role. Now, if you ask me, do I ask all my girls to pray? And no. We do depend on mental health professionals. We do go to psychiatrists. We do go to clinical psychologists. But the fact of the matter is, in a world, the Western world and the European world is talking so much of stigma. Think of India, how much of stigma will be there about mental health. So in that stigmatized space, faith offers a non-stigmatized platform for people to speak, have catharsis, have care for trauma. For a young victim, if I have to talk from my context, let me take one religious text, Bhagavad Gita, and another Mahabharata. Mahabharata, if it is a text of psychopathology, Bhagavad Gita in the 18 chapters is 18 techniques of psychotherapy. Now, what would be better for a victim who believes that going to a psychiatrist will make her branded as a mad person, or use Bhagavad Gita to, build that trust in her that, she can heal too. Many people in India have understood the beautiful intersection between mental health professionals and faith healers. One extraordinary project has been the Dawa and Dua project. Dawa is medicine and Dua is prayer. And this is an extraordinary partnership between faith healers and mental health professionals. In India, around 68% of people will go to a faith healer for mental health concern than to a doctor. And therefore, what they have done, and this happens in the temples, it can happen in a dargah or a shrine, or it can happen in a church. So what this whole project is all about is mental health professionals immersing in a religious space, creating a respectful environment, understanding each other's skills, building the skills and techniques for referral. Now, when do you say this is a serious disorder and requires medication and has to be moved to the psychiatrist? Hey, faith healers are trained for that, and mental health professionals are trained in respectfully understanding what faith is doing to this person. I think that is the kind of respectful environment of collaboration and intersection that we need to bring in, instead of talking about this or that. There's good in this and there's good in this. Religion can be exploitative too. So how do we minimize through a professional collaborative approach is what we should be looking from a solution-based angle.
Thank you. And I want us to be invited back again, so I think I will end the controversial questions and answers here, and we have some time left for maybe one or two questions from, we have some folks already standing up. So one or two questions from the audience, if possible. I will use my microphone, if someone can just help me hand this around.
Michael, Femu. Oh God, those are intense questions. So I want to say to you before I ask the question, I worked for the Catholic Church for 7 years. It's not a monolith. I'm encouraging all of my priest besties to get out there in Poland now to wear their collars and say, women dying from abortion, from medical care, from not having the medical care they needed, it's on you. Blood's on your hands. Priest Lukas Mudrak of Lublin, you get out there, right? And he's going. So it's not a monolith. You'd like the Jesuits. They're nice.
May I 1 second?
Yep.
Dad, can you stand up for a second, please? My father was an evangelical missionary for many, many years.
Okay.
And I grew up in a very, very evangelical home.
Okay, good.
And it was deeply traumatizing and the most beautiful, rich, values and giving childhood that I could have asked for.
So you get me.
Yes.
I worked for the church for 7 years. Okay, so I actually want to ask my peers permission to ask Sunitha a question that I wanted to ask in the previous session. Is that okay? Okay. Sunitha, about a month into the Ukrainian war response in Poland, ignorant volunteers set up at a Tesco site a facility where women and children could go in order to get bused wherever they wanted to within the European Union. Ignorant volunteers, naive volunteers, because once they were in the European Union, as soon as they got on a bus, they could have disappeared. Was the UN there? At the beginning, no. Was the Polish government there? At the beginning, no. Did I lose my shit on those volunteers? Because they were well-intentioned and ignorant and naive. So you were telling us before it's on us, right? It's on our MO is to support those women and children. Those volunteers didn't know that they were naive and ignorant until some crazy Mexican American from California started screaming at them. We reported it, the UN showed up, the Polish government showed up, the police showed up, and it was converted into something that was safe. But my question is, in that circumstance, those volunteers were well-intentioned and naive and ignorant. So how do we collectively address our idiocy and naivete and ignorance?
By making an effort to educate ourselves, by having the courage to listen to what is being said, for having the courage to open our eyes to the reality of the world. Very often, naivety and ignorance comes from the fact that you don't want to even listen and open your eyes to reality. Many years back, I produced a movie. My husband is sitting here, right here with a hat. He's a movie maker. We both did a movie called as Na Bangaru Talli, which was on sex trafficking. Nobody went to the theaters to watch it. Nobody. Including my friends. And when I asked them why you didn't go to the theaters, they said, we can't handle this reality. We all want to be ostriches in different ways. And until unless we don't have the courage of conviction to break it, I'm sure my session was not a comfortable session, and I applaud each one of you all for sitting through it, because that shows your courage and conviction. Your naivety can be lost only through your courage of conviction to know the truth and ask the right questions to find out how to go about it. All of us will make mistakes. 31 years back, I was also a naive youngster who made a lot of mistakes. But it took me many, many years to learn. And the important part is I kept myself open for learning and learning from all my failures. So one failure cannot be the deciding factor for their naivety. They will become wise after a few years.
Thank you. And we are already over time, and I'm so sorry. All of these powerful women will be right out here somewhere, I'm sure, or they'll run away from your questions. So we do have to end this, unfortunately, but thank you so much to our incredible panelists. And thank all of you for being with us.